In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to protect the admin routes. So only users who have the admin role can access, manage orders, and manage products. So earlier, we implemented this auth guard to protect a few routes from being accessed by anonymous users. Now we need a similar auth guard, but in this guard, we're going to check to see if this user is an admin or not. So let's open up the terminal and generate a new service. I'm going to call this admin-auth-guard. First, let's register this as a provider here, admin auth guard service. And also I would like to rename this to be consistent with the other auth guard we created. So let's just call this admin auth guard. Okay. Now let's go to the implementation of this guard. So here, just like before, we need to implement the can activate interface. And we need to add a method called can activate. Now let's quickly open the other auth guard. So authguard.ts. Earlier, I explained that here we don't necessarily have to return a Boolean. We can return an observable of Boolean. So earlier, we mapped this user observable to an observable of Boolean. We're going to take a similar approach here, but as part of this, we need to check to see if the user is admin or not. So first, we need to inject our auth service here. Private auth of type auth service. Now in can activate, we're going to call this .auth .user observable, just like before. And we're going to map this. So here we get a user object. Look at the type of this user object. It's a Firebase.user object. This is something I want you to pay great attention to. So this user object is the user that is represented by Firebase as part of authentication. It's not the user object that we store in our database. We need to differentiate between these two types. So this user object that Firebase gives us has properties like UID, display name, email, and so on. It doesn't have the isAdmin property. That belongs to our application user objects, right? So we need to get this Firebase user object and then read the actual application user object from our database. So first we need to go to our user service and define a new method for reading a user. So let's go to user.ts. Just like we have this save method, we're going to have a get method. So get takes a UID, which is a string, and it's going to return an application user object. So return this .db.object. The location is /users/ plus UID. Now, if you look at the return type of this method, you can see it returns Firebase object observable of any. So this any represents our application user objects that we store in the database. Now I want to properly annotate this method. I'm going to define a new interface called app user, and you will see why shortly. So in our app folder, I'm going to add a new folder called models. This is where we define all the models of our application. So let's add a new model, app-user.ts. So here we simply export an interface called app user. And in this interface, we're going to have three properties: name, which is a string, email, also a string, and isAdmin, which is a Boolean. Now with this interface, we can properly annotate this new method in our user service. So we can annotate this as Firebase object observable of app user. Let's import these types. Okay. Now we have a clean implementation in this service. So let's go back to our guard and finish our implementation. So in the map method, we get a Firebase user object, and now we need to map this to an app user object. So I'm going to inject another parameter here, private user service of type user service. Now in our map operator, we can call this .user service .get. We need to give it this UID. We can read that from this user object. Okay. Now I want to show you something. Let's subscribe to this observable here. X goes to console.log X. I have a question for you. What do you think is the type of this X parameter in the subscribe method? It's void. Look, X is void. Because here in our map function, we are not returning anything. So we're getting a Firebase user object and we're simply calling our service. We are not returning any values. That's why when subscribing, we get void. Now what happens if we return this value? What do you think is the type of this X parameter? It's a Firebase object observable of user. Look, Firebase object observable of app user, because that's what we're returning from this method. Look, we annotated this method to return a Firebase object observable, right? And that's why when we subscribe, the type of X is Firebase object observable. Now there is a tiny problem here. This X object is an observable. It's not the actual app user object. So in order to get that app user, we need to call x.subscribe. And that looks really ugly. We don't want to write code like that. Ideally, what I want is that when we map this Firebase user object, we get an app user in our subscribe method. How can we do that? Well, instead of this map operator, we're going to use a different operator called switch map. So this switch map does mapping as the name implies, but it also switches to this new observable. So we start with the first observable and then we switch to a new observable and forget about the old one. And with this, as a result, in our subscribe method, we're going to get an app user object. Now here we don't see that because the code is not compiled properly. Let me import this operator on the top. So import rxjs, add operator switch map. Now look at the type of X. X is an app user. So I'm not going to call subscribe here. We don't want to subscribe to this because we want to return an observable of Boolean from this can activate method. Let's annotate it for readability. So observable of Boolean. And let's import this. So how can we solve this problem? Very easy. Here we're going to map this app user object. So X is app user. And we're going to return app user dot is admin. Now, let's import this map operator on the top as well. And finally, to solve this compilation error, we need to return the result here. Now, the code still looks a little bit ugly, and that's probably the reason you're confused. Let me clean this up a bit further, and then you will understand exactly what is happening here. So, in this arrow function, because we have only one line, we don't need to put it in curly braces and use this return keyword. So I'm going to remove return, as well as the curly braces and the semicolon. Now I put this on one line. Look at the result. We start with this user observable. We map and switch to a new observable returned from our user service.get method. At this point, we get an app user object, and we're mapping the result to a Boolean, which is determined based on the value of isAdmin property. Okay? So this is our new admin OSGuard. Now let's use this in app module. So here's the app module. I want to protect these two routes, admin/products and admin/orders. Let me quickly reformat this code. So this can activate takes an array of auth guards. We have passed our first auth guard to make sure the user is logged in. And now we can pass the second auth guard, that is admin auth guard. So if the user is logged in, then the second guard is executed to make sure the user is an admin user. Now similarly, I'm going to add that here, admin auth guard. Now let's test the application. So currently I'm an admin. Let's go to manage orders. And you can see we are on admin orders page. However, if I go to the database and change this to false, or remove this property, and then refresh here, I'm automatically redirected to the home page. So I cannot access that route anymore.